What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Colton Posey Fishing. So today we're going to go down here and we're going to talk about the best baits for October fishing pressured lakes, okay? So stay tuned. This is something you don't want to miss. What do you think, little man? What do you think, little man? So best baits for October. So now that this is just my opinion, this is what I use during October. This is what I have the most success on, to be honest with you. So the first thing, let's talk about our spinning setup. So a lot of times you're going to have to do a lot of finesse. A lot of this finesse stuff is due to a lot of pressure being on the lakes throughout the summer, and then we're transitioning into the fall. So we've got that going on. We've also got the regulating temperature. So, you know, during the day it's hot, at night it's cold. I mean, they're getting adjusted to everything, kind of like we are. So the first thing I like to use for a spinning setup, especially if I'm wanting that reaction bite, I like a, it's called a Horsehead. It's, I don't know if y'all remember, but when Casey Ashley won the Bassmaster Classic, this is what he won it off of. This Horsehead underspin, it's got a little bit of a different action. It's more subtle. And I like to team it up with a Zoom Super Fluke Junior. You can change the color of the heads however you prefer, whether you wanted a natural color. I typically stick with the solid white, mimic shad and other stuff. But it's one of those things that you're just going to slow reel it. You're going to slow reel it through those fish that are moved out and suspended, who's been pressured a lot. Because what happens is these guys are throwing all these baits with all this movement. You know, they're flipping jigs, and they've got their worms bouncing up off the bottom, coming straight up, down, doing all this and doing all that. The tail's got a lot of action. So a lot of times moving to that stuff that's real subtle will help you trigger bites just because it's different. Now, like I always say, location, and that's for another video. We're going to go over the location in the next video. So the second setup that I like, as far as the spinning setup, this is for those fish that you found. So when you find these fish and they're out suspended, a lot of people are throwing jigging spoons and stuff like that. You get hung up a lot. You lose a lot of money on baits, especially if you don't have a pocket knocker. If you don't know what a pocket knocker is, go on Tackle Warehouse or wherever you go and look at pocket knockers. They will save you a lot of money, especially if you know how to use it. But if I'm sitting on top of a school of fish and I'm trying to intrigue them to bite, a lot of times a drop shot works perfect. The leader, it kind of all depends on how do I explain it. You kind of want, I at least, minimum, have at least 2 foot from my hook to my weight, okay? So what I like to throw on my drop shot 90% of the time is a robo worm. I use the Robo Finesse worms. This color is probably one of my favorite, Aaron's Magic. It's just got a real natural color. It's got a real good looking color to it. Works great. So your drop shot, you're typically going to drop it straight down, and then you're going to sit there and shake it. Sometimes, especially with the robo worms, you can just let it sit, and that worm will stick straight out and barely have any movement whatsoever. When you want it to move, just move it a little bit. If you got expensive grabs and you know how to use them, you can sit there and watch them come up to it, or, you know, they won't, and then you can adjust from there. So third spinning setup that I really like is a Shaky Head. Shaky Head is wonderful. I typically run a screw lock setup on my Shaky Head typically. Now there's two different kinds of Shaky Heads that I really prefer to use. One is this one right here with the screw lock. You screw it up, you butt your hook up, and the worm's just straight as an arrow. So when you throw that worm, it's going to hit the water and then it's going to sink straight down. Now, the other setup that I like does not have the screw lock. It's a twist. So basically, you put the worm up and you twist it around kind of like you're doing the old school hooks. But the key to it is I actually want that little bit of a U in my worm when I go to rig it. And why is that? Because when I throw that bait and it hits the water, it does a spiral action all the way down. And a lot of times, just because it's falling different and doing the spiral action, it'll trigger those bites. Now, the worms that I like to use, typically on a Shaky Head, is the Zoom Magnum Shaky Head. Whatever color you prefer on your lake or river, whatever you're fishing, but I typically like these. They have really good action. They're also real subtle if you want them to be subtle. But typically, as soon as that Shaky Head hits the bottom, I'm sitting there just shaking it. That's it. And then I'll slide it up wherever I need it to, and then reel up my slack, shake it a little bit more. But a Shaky Head, it's hard to beat. Now, my setups for this. Now, on the Horsehead, I typically run about a 7-foot medium action rod. And the reason that I do that is because I'm using fluorocarbon line. I'm running about 8-pound test on all this stuff. Okay. Fluorocarbon line does not have stretch like monofilament does. So if you're on a slow reel and the fish are not biting good and you don't have that extra stretch, they may not get the bait as good. So with that medium action rod, that gives me enough time to load up. So they have a little bit of that resistance. Now on the drop shot, I'm running typically the same thing, about a 7-foot or a 7'3" medium action. And then on my Shaky Head rod, I'm running a 7-foot medium heavy. I want a little bit of stiffness, but I also want a little bit of give. So medium fat or medium heavy fast tip. Okay. Now let's move on to casting. So one of my favorite things about the fall is topwater. It is time to throw topwater and really cover a lot of water. So if you're really having a lot of trouble finding fish, locating where these fish are hanging out, topwater is going to be your best bet. My favorite thing to throw this time of year is just a simple walking bait. Okay. I like to throw, most of the time, I like to throw like a head and one knocker. And the reason for that is they get used to all summer long of seeing the typical walking baits with the mini rattles. That kind of, they get adjusted to this stuff, okay? So the one knocker kind of throws something completely different at them. It's a different sound, same technique, but it's a different sound, and it can trigger bites. Now, what I'm doing with this is I'm moving it 100 miles an hour. I mean, I'm just working it as fast as I can back to the boat. I'm trying to locate fish, because there's two things that's going to happen when you throw this bait 100 miles an hour. They're either going to blow up and miss it, but now you know where the fish are, or they're going to tear it up. If they tear it up, you've got a fun day ahead of you. But the key is the setup to not getting exhausted. So this rod, this is Impulse. This is the Zell Rolling Topwater rod. It's a 6'8" medium action rod. But the key to topwater is monofilament line. I'm throwing a 15 to 20 pound trilene monofilament. Whatever brand you prefer to use, but I typically use the extra tough monofilament from Trilene. And that way this bait has some stretch, okay? The rod has got stretch, the line has got stretch. They have no problems getting a mouthful. Literally all I got to do is reel. I mean, you're going to set the hook and stuff, but typically on your topwater baits, you're going to let them set the hook on themselves. And the reason for that is because if I have too stiff of a rod, I'm jerking that lure right out of their mouth. So make sure you got a good medium rod. Another key, I'm not a big guy on technique specific rods. I just want to make that clear. But if you are going to throw a topwater all day, you need to be comfortable. You really need to be comfortable. So if you're going to get a good topwater rod that you prefer, this handle right here is, let me show you. This handle is super short compared to most. So if you look right here, see the difference? So what that does is when I'm working this bait, the end of this rod's not bumping my arm every 5 seconds. I'm comfortable. I'm moving as fast as I want to. I'm just constantly rolling. It's just real comfortable. Lightweight, lightweight. That's the key too. So keep that in mind. Now we're going to talk about another one of my favorites. This is a Fluke. I love throwing a simple Fluke, weightless. Okay, I typically throw them weightless. All I'm doing is I've got a 3/0 Gamakatsu Superline hook. The reason I throw the Superline hook, that Superline hook's thicker, so it gives it a little bit of weight, so it falls a little bit quicker, but it still has that great action. So if you want to slow it down, use your typical, 3/4 hook, whatever you prefer to use. But I typically go with the Superline just because it's a little bit heavier and it gives it that fall. But I simply just Texas rig a Fluke, either a Zoom or a Yum Fluke, and I'm working it 100 miles an hour. Okay, it's wonderful because I can skip this thing under docks, under brush piles. I can throw it here, there, everywhere, and really trigger those bites. That's the key. When you're getting up under these docks and stuff, they're typically used to seeing swim baits and things like that. But a lot of times these Flukes, people doesn't throw them a whole lot up under docks. So it just helps trigger bites, and you will know it if you get one bit under a dock. It sounds like a cannonball exploding. So my typical setup for a Fluke, 6'9" power is a medium. Okay, I throw a medium on this, but it's also a fast tip. So and don't forget, if you're going to be throwing a Fluke, if you're going to be throwing anything weightless, you need a high-speed reel. So I suggest at least a 7:1-to-1 gear ratio reel. You want to be able to take up line really fast because they're going to hammer it and they're going to be gone with it. You want to catch up with that line, get that line tight, set the hook, okay? So that's my setup for round docks and stuff like that. Now next, this is one of my absolute favorite times to throw a crankbait. So anybody that knows me knows that I'm a power fisherman. I love to fish fast. I love to cover a lot of water because I don't want to spend my whole day in one creek and only catch 2 or 3 fish. I want to keep moving as much as I can. If I only catch 5 fish, well, that's better than 2. Okay, so the Spro rock crawler, and I mean, you can see it's all beat up, look like it's been drugged behind a truck. But this is where the pocket knockers and stuff come in. This thing right here, I don't know if you can actually see it, but the lip there is just all kinds of eat up. It literally feels like sandpaper. I'm literally taking this thing, this Spro rock crawler right here, I think it's the 55 model. It dives to like 10 to 12 foot. I throw this on 15-pound fluorocarbon, and as soon as this sucker hits the water, I'm pounding it up against everything. I'm reeling almost as fast as I can. I don't want to super exaggerate the speed like I would during the summer. During the summer, I'm just cranking as hard as I can, trying to get that bait to move as fast as I can. During the fall, it's kind of in between that medium pace reel and that fast pace reel. I'm kind of right there in a soft medium. I'm still moving it pretty quick, but I've got it slowed down a little bit. But the key is making sure this thing keeps contact with something. Rocks, brush piles, laydowns, anything that you can keep contact with it. If it's just clay bottom, let's say you're fishing a clay lake, clay bottom, just have that thing burning up against the ground. They absolutely love it. I'm throwing this on a 7-foot cranking rod. This is one of the rods from Duckett, just a Green Ghost cranking rod. And I typically throw that 6:8-to-1 gear ratio reel. The reason I throw a little bit slower gear ratio, it's not that much slower than a 7:1-to-1, but the reason I want that little bit of slowness is so I have more torque. I can really pull that fish in if I need to. So 15-pound fluorocarbon, kind of a medium fast reel, just so you have that power and leadway. Really helps. All right. Next. Spinnerbait. A buddy of mine, Corey, over at Ace High Bengals, he can tell you everything you want to know about a spinnerbait. That man throws a spinnerbait every time he touches the water. So I like to throw my spinner baits on a 7-foot medium heavy rod. This is a Duckett Triad. It has the micro guides on it where I have a lot more accurate cast. And the reason that is key is because I'm throwing this spinner bait up into laydowns. I'm throwing it up into docks and stuff like that and bringing it out. Typically on your muddy water situations, I'm typically using a double Colorado setup this time of year. But now, like this year, we've had not a whole lot of rain, so the reservoirs are super clear. Especially places like Smith Lake and stuff like that that never really muddies up anyways. So typically on stuff like that, I'm going to be throwing a double willow or something I can move quicker, but not many people throw a Colorado. So a lot of times on your river fish and stuff like that, you can toss these Colorados around pads and docks and stuff like that, and you can bring them on out for the strike. Now I like throwing a 7:1 gear ratio on my spinner bait. I just like having a little bit of extra speed in case I need it, because a lot of times I am throwing the willow blades. But this time of year specific, especially on a river reservoir, I'm throwing double Colorado. I'm not moving it super fast to where the spinner bait's rolling, but I'm not moving it super slow either. I'm trying to get it on without having too much of a roll or anything like that. All right, next one, and probably my favorite one. I absolutely love a Texas rig. I have done more good in a tournament on a Texas rig than I have anything else. Texas rig and jigs is absolutely my favorite. Now my setup for a Texas rig is specific to what I like, okay? I'm not going to say that this would be a perfect setup for anybody else. I'm not sure. I like a 7'1" medium heavy rod, fast action tip, and a 7, this or actually I'm sorry, this is a 8:1 gear ratio reel, super fast. Now you're not gonna have a whole lot of power, but the reason I throw that 8:1 gear ratio is because half the time I have my worm, I'm picking it up and I'm dropping it, and then I let it sit, and those fish pick it up and start moving with it and create slack in my line. This is an 8:1 gear ratio. I can make like half a turn and all that slack's gone. I can set the hook. Okay. This specifically, the 8:1 is not something I would use for flipping a Texas rig into heavy cover. Okay. I want something slow where I have a lot of power and a lot of control over the fish. I'm talking specifically for just throwing a worm, down a rock bank or clay or brush pile or something like that, okay? Not necessarily a deep brush pile, but just simply just throwing a Texas rig down the side of a bank, okay? Not in real heavy cover like pads or something that requires like braided line or 20-pound test. Now I throw 15-pound test on my worm rod typically. Sometimes I'll move down to a 12, especially if I'm fishing a real clear water reservoir. So what I like to typically throw on my Texas rig depends on the fish. So if we're talking about fish that's been heavily pressured, I'm typically going to go with something like a Yum Dinger. Okay, some of you might call it a Cinco or whatever, but I typically throw a Dinger. The reason for that is it does not have a whole lot of action. Okay, your ribbon tails like this, they're going to have a lot of action in the tails, but the Dinger does not. So you can really just scoot that bait along. Doesn't have a whole lot of action. It's real subtle. A creep up on it, it's gone. So now the other Texas rig thing is a ribbon tail. Okay, typically if the bite gets extremely tough, extremely tough, I'm going to throw just a simple ribbon tail worm, and I'm just going to slow reel that thing, not just creeping with it, but just steady moving, because I'm not looking for the fish to run it down and eat it, but I'm looking for them just to react to it. I'm trying to get that bait as close as I can to them to get them to react to that bait. Okay, now my other favorite thing, a stand-up jig. Okay, typically on my stand-up jigs, I like throwing, or I say stand-up jigs, football head or anything like that. I like throwing a 7'3" medium heavy action rod. Okay, this is the Duckett Triad. Also, it's got the micro guys that way I have really good precision. when I'm throwing the bait. 7.5 to 1 gear ratio reel. I do like a little bit quicker reel, but I don't want that 8:1 to 1 gear ratio, so I kind of make up on power with that. But either way, this stand-up jig has got a flat head, and what this thing does is when it hits bottom, if you're using a rubber skirt, the skirt's going to just fall down. Okay, it's going to look like a mop laying on the bottom of the floor, or on the bottom of the lake, or whatever you're fishing. If you have a silicone or a rubber jig, then the rubber will actually stand up. And this is where your trailers come in. So I like a Rage Tail Crawl or a Christie Crawl, either one. Usually if I throw a Christie Crawl, I typically like to get Yum's crawfish scent, spread a little bit of that on it. Always seems to help. But either way, your rubber skirts is going to flare out, and that bait is going to be right in between, sticking up, doing just like that. So it's going to look like a crawfish in a defensive position. Now, if they don't really want something that's moving a lot or anything like that, that's where your silicone jigs come in, to where it'll just fall down. And then you could, put whatever trailer you want on it. It kind of looks like something just sitting on the bottom. So you have to play around with it a little bit. Now with my jigs, typically this time of year, I like to pop them. So I will take my rod and I will simply just pop the tip of my rod, and that jig will just hop, 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 hop. I'll do it like 3 times, stop, once, stop, twice, stop, 3 times. Just keep mixing it up like that. And usually it'll trigger some bites. But typically if you get bit on the jig, it's usually going to be those tournament busters. So now the second jig that I like to throw also is a Finesse Jig. So this is a 1/2 ounce Finesse Jig. It's a supernatural color. The reason I like the Finesse Jig is because I can skip this thing under docks. So if you're running side imaging or something like that, you're looking out to the side of your boat, maybe you see a brush pile or something up under a dock that you really, really want to target, you can skip this Finesse Jig under there and work it through there, okay? I like throwing 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon, 7'3" medium heavy once again, but I like throwing a 7.5 to 1 gear ratio, or 7/8 to 1, whichever one you prefer. Now if I'm throwing in a real heavy cover, again, I will bring that gear ratio down. That way I have that power where I can pull that fish out if I need to. But either way, that typically the Rage or the Christie Crawl is wonderful as a jig trailer on this. Also, just remember on your reel, if the water looks really good and it's a very pretty day, you want those natural colors the best you can. If you got muddy water, it's a whole different story, depending on whether it's sunny or whether it's dim. But just keep mixing up stuff. You swap from light colors to dark colors. Try to figure out what's working within the color spectrum, because there's not going to be that, like if I'm using a plum and I'm using a black and blue, there's not going to be a whole lot of if I throw that plum around the bass, they're probably going to bite it. If I throw that black and blue around the bass, they're probably going to bite it. But now if I'm throwing a solid white worm, either they're going to bite it or they're not. And if I throw a black worm, they're either going to bite it or they're not. So there's 2 different shades of color. So try to mix that stuff up and see what you come up with, because every reservoir is different. I mean, I can tell you what they'd more than likely be hitting at Bear Creek right now, but I can't tell you what they're eating right now at Lake Hartwell. I can give you my best guess, but either way, it's still my opinion. So you really, really have to play with it. Plus, it helps you learn to be super versatile. That's one of the key things. You got to make sure you know how to mix it up. Make sure you don't get hung up on one thing all the time. So, Finesse Jig and a stand-up jig. Now, another one that I really, really like this time of year, swim jig. This swim jig, I really like the Hack Attack swim jigs. If you're fishing something like a spotted bass fishery, that may not be your best bet, just because the hooks on the Hack Attacks are super big, and a lot of times the spots, they just don't get it that good. G-Money jigs, Dirty Jigs, all those guys, they make good quality swim jigs. The only thing I would say about the Dirty Jigs, their hooks and stuff seem to rust really, really fast. I have no idea why. It's just that's just been my luck with dirty jigs. But they make some really pretty jigs also. But typically I'm pitching this thing up under docks, skipping up under docks. I'm throwing it through paths, I'm throwing it through brush piles and stuff like that. I typically like to run something like a money crawl, Yum money crawl. The reason I like this is because the pinchers on this thing are super thick, and they've just got a real wide wobbling action that's a little bit different, and it seems to really help trigger strikes, especially when you're moving through brush piles, when you're running through lily pads, things like that. That's really where this thing seems to really shine, those river reservoirs with that setup. Now, typically what I like throwing on my swim jig is a 7 foot 4-inch heavy action rod. Okay, I really like that long stiff rod to where if they hit it and pull me back up under something, I've got that extra length to hopefully get that leverage to get them out. But I like throwing a 7:1 gear ratio with this. A little bit slower reel. It gives me a little bit of torque. So that's really helpful. Now the last and final thing I want to share with you is my other absolute favorite thing. 7'6" cranking rod. Okay, this is for deep, heavy cranking. I'm throwing a 6:4 to 1 gear ratio reel on this thing, and I'm throwing a super deep. This is a DT20 or DT22, something like that. Either way, it's a deep diving crankbait. And what I'm doing with this sucker is, once I get my graph on some fish and I see those fish schooled up, I'm backing off and I'm making super long casts past the fish, okay? And once I get that bait past the fish and it hits the water, I'm burning that thing straight down. I got my rod tip in the water, I'm burning it as fast as I can. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring that bait through those fish, right through the center of those fish, or right up above the top of those fish, as fast as I can. I'm not looking to get those suspended inactive fish to be like, oh, there's a nice lunch, I'm gonna run it down and eat it. No, I'm just trying to get them to be like, it's kind of like if somebody throws something at you real quick and you just instantly, your first thing to do is to catch it. I'm trying to get those bass to react to it. And if I can get one of them fired up on this, you'll sit there and hammer on them all day. You may be on a school of 20 fish and not even know it until you catch one. Kind of what happened with me at the Neely Henry tournament. I caught like 60-something fish in one spot. I mean, just hammered them. All I had to do was just throw something to get them agitated, aggravated, wanted to eat. So, guys, that's the best baits, in my opinion, for October. It's what I prefer to use anyways. So, all this stuff also pertains to fishing or pressured lakes, okay? So, we're going to kind of, on the next video, I'm going to really go in depth over heavily pressured fisheries and give you my insight on it that will hopefully help you catch some fish. So I appreciate it, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Share the videos, get the word out there. Helps me a whole lot. See you next time.